So the last punk genre that I want to get into in any kind of detail is actually one that I thought I'd already. Okay, a cat is scratching at cardboard box. Interesting. It's one that I already thought actually I'd actually dealt with, so to speak. One I'd already gone through because next after cyberpunk, it is probably the best known one. But it's surrounded by a lot of misunderstandings, um, and actually is a very good way to exemplify one of the problems with punk genres, and that is steampunk. Now, the basics are fairly simple. It takes its origins in the maybe Victorian, maybe a bit earlier, maybe a bit later period of English history, and by English I mean actual England, Great Britain, and it takes that and pushes against it a bit with the idea that steam technology was advanced, that it advanced beyond what it historically did, just like the others I've talked about. It's taking one of the main technologies of the era and basically just advancing it massively. But it is a punk genre, which means that it's not just about the tech, it's about society. And the idea is that just as it was in actual history, the society of steampunk is going through massive changes. Industrialism is a big deal with old money, like aristocrats, the nobles, um, the monarchy, the church, probably, if you're into that. Um, that's all old money, and they have a problem with new money appearing in the form of bankers and factory owners and what's grouped together as industrialists. And the idea of political radicals, mainly just people who want change, but in a very conservative, old timey society. Any demands for change is kind of radical. Um, and just like in real life, there is conflict between the classes, and in reality, in the real world, the lower classes were starting to get their hands on more dangerous stuff like explosives and some kind of guns and stuff, and were basically starting to spread the idea of revolution against the rich. But in steampunk, that is often taken a bit farther with actual real conflict lurking around the corner or just breaking out around the corner. And the increasingly powerful tools being or leading to more dangerous, more destructive conflicts. So it's the old put it to the stick it to the man mentality of the other punk genres, with the technology starting to race out of control element added also from the other punk genres. But steampunk especially has, this might be a strong word, but I would say it has suffered from the fact that the aesthetics have in many ways outgrown the genre itself. The idea of steam powered or um, clockwork powered gadgetry being decoration, and people interpreting steampunk as meaning people running around with all kinds of knickknacks mixed with an old timey British fashion sense. And that has dominated steampunk a lot, the visuals, which means that a lot of attention in the public sphere has been driven away from the story elements, the narrative elements of steampunk in favor of these visuals. But the conflict is still there. The fiction, the stories, the conflict is still there. It is an uproar against oppression with very little to show that any victory can be had. The monarchy and aristocracy, the clergy, the new industrialists, they may be fighting among themselves, but they are so far ahead in power and wealth that everybody else is basically just struggling to find their own place among them. And it's usually a matter of trying to fit into that system while trying to break it apart without getting caught. It is sometimes as bleak as cyberpunk, but not always. Cyberpunk has the very real feeling that it's all just far too big and you should just give up. Steampunk still has this rebel spirit that might be born from the actual historical events. What I'm thinking of right now, other than the usual social upheavals that led to, for example, the Bolshevik revolutions, there is also something like the Luddites, which were anti anti industry revolutionaries, smashing automated factories that were taking away jobs from craftsmen. And that, of course, is always a losing battle because if you can be replaced by something that is cheaper, better, and more predictable, you will be. But there is always conflict, and with poverty being a very real thing, something that is also very historically correct. The word Dickensian from Charles Dickens' writings is sometimes thrown around. The idea of exploring how horrible life is and how destitute life is for the lowest in society, the poorest in society. With that being a real thing, revolution is almost inevitable because it's not just ideology. These are very often people fighting to stay alive, fighting to feed themselves. So it is an age of turmoil and internal conflict. And sometimes it plays on the idea of external conflict brewing on the horizon. This was, after all, the years and decades leading up to the world wars, which could be argued to have come about because of how technology advanced at a very rapid pace. The world wars would not have been possible if the destructive technology hadn't been there, after all. So, steampunk has a lot of social conflict within it, but the visuals tend to outshine it. leading to some misunderstandings of what it is, to the point that steampunk starts looking more like a festive celebration of innovation more than the gritty punk genre it really is. A lot of focus that is often overlooked in other punk genres is on how unsafe a lot of technology is. Again, probably based in real history, in that a lot of factory work, a lot of mining and other work was hideously dangerous, often causing deaths and dismemberment across the board. So all this fancy technology, that's another part that the visuals kind of push into the back, because it doesn't serve the visuals to keep it in mind, is that this technology was often overpowered, faulty, unsafe, poorly made, and very complicated to use, and people were perhaps not trained for it. And that is a recurring element in some steampunk, at least. But the entire genre does seem to have been detoured a bit by, again, a love for the visuals. But other than that, it really is a punk genre as punk genres are. Again, the fight between the haves and the have nots, the merciless on march of technology over quality of life, and also a decadence that mirrors the decadence in cyberpunk. That's something I haven't really talked about in the other punk genres, because it tends to slip into the background. But there is a decadence of the wealthy that is often brought in to kind of show how deep the divide is between the haves and the have-nots. And in steampunk, one difference is that the decadence is often very close to the conflict, because in actual history, cities were still not big enough to be all that stratified. They were not big enough to have the rich living completely isolated from the poor. And especially because manual labor was still a big part of industry, the rich were still dependent on the poor in a very face to face manner. So the rich and the poor reluctantly mingled in many ways, not as peers, and not as if they socialized, but their dependency on one another made them put them into contact with each other, meaning that the haves and the have-nots are constantly meeting, and that means that the decadence is not just far away. The decadence and opulence is often right in the face of those who suffer from it, and thus those who fight against it. So in steampunk, more than any other punk genre perhaps, the decadence and opulence of the wealthy plays a very visual role, very nearby. I don't know the best phrase for it. It's very close to the battle. It's not some distant thing. The conflict and the opulence, the conflict and the ones who benefit from the conflict, they're not entirely divided as they often are in cyberpunk. It's practically a theme that those who benefit from the social conflicts are so far above, sometimes literally physically above, either high up in skyscrapers or actually in space, that they are not physically present. They are not physically influenced by any of it. Not so in steampunk. That is perhaps the biggest difference between steampunk and cyberpunk. That the conflict is very close to the doorstep of those who benefit from it. Wealth and conflict are more closely tied in the world of steampunk. A part of that is also that the sprawl is not does not play the same role in steampunk as it does in cyberpunk. Again, this has historical roots, I'm sure, because cities had problems growing um, due to issues of architecture, sanitation, and all those nifty things, which is often shown in steampunk as, or is often, it's sometimes shown in steampunk as cities trying to grow, but the burden of the growth falling on the less fortunate. Sometimes the poor, sometimes actually the emerging middle classes. A middle class is not was not really that much of a thing in the historical period, but it was starting to emerge. And in steampunk, it is a more complex mix of people wanting to attain wealth, an idea that was perhaps less seemed less realistic in the real history of the times. So the growth of cities benefits the rich, crushes the poor, and traps the those in the middle in a constant struggle to even survive as things like, again, architecture, sanitation, crime, anything that denser populations cause starts mounting, because those who have all the money are not that interested in people with less money being safe from crime and having sanitation and such. They are fairly content with dumping the problems on the doorstep of the less fortunate. So you got the burgeoning cities, you got the rapidly advancing technology, you got industrialism, you got industrialism versus old money versus new money. You've got a lot of conflicts that get magnified through the lens of steampunk. So next time you see some fancy top hat with 3 levels of driving goggles and some kind of sword cane attached, remember that it's more than just the visuals. And this is where also where fantasy starts getting a bit sidelined. That's perhaps the best way to phrase it. There is steampunk fantasy. It's a genre, and it's not a small genre. There are plenty of examples of it with the steampunk ethos mixed in with elves and dwarfs and magic, and with industrialists and dragons hoarding the wealth, literally in some cases. Uh, but those examples often really sideline the internal social conflicts of steampunk and focus on the neat steam technologies, and often even the upper classes in society rather than the ones struggling, often taking the sides of monarchists or the like, which are still a fantasy stable after all, kings, queens, and having high adventures, um, often high fantasy style adventures with swashbucklers and the like, swashbucklers from dirigibles and using clockwork swords and whatever you can think of, fighting dark fairies and stuff like that. There is some conflict of industrialism versus nature in some cases, but the less dark elements of steampunk often take over when it becomes steampunk fantasy. It doesn't need to, it's just something that happens. There's plenty of room for conflict, but steampunk in itself already has a lot of conflict, so for some it might simply be too much. But you can definitely have both monarchists and industrialists fighting against the forces of nature, very literally, like elves and fairies and nature magic. And things like seances and spirituality were also very big in the real history of the times. So having it be actual real magic just adds more wild cards to the mix. So there's plenty to dive into in steampunk other than just some fancy gadgets and top hats. Plenty of story opportunities.